My guest today is the legendary award-winning producer, director, Emmy winner, and Golden Globe nominee, Steve Bender. Steve has written, produced, and directed dozens of television shows and TV specials, and it was his creative and visionary talents that ushered in new ways to entertain television audiences across the globe. Steve Bender was a hidden talent working in the mailroom until one man placed him in the director's chair, and at the time with no experience. But that soon changed, and with each year, he was making television as well as music history. He was influential in creating programming with racially and ethnically diverse cast and broke the color barrier long before Norman Lear ever did. The Los Angeles Times called Steve Bender's first feature film The T.A.M.I. Show, the greatest of all rock and roll films. From there, it was Hullabaloo, to the famed Petula Clark TV Special with the touch seen around the world. And he directed Diana Ross's iconic concert in Central Park. Steve Bender is so talented, I believe he queued up the thunderstorm during her first set, and that is still talked about today. The man knows how to get an audience's attention with lighting and maybe with lightning. But in 1968, lightning struck in the most mysterious of ways. He conceived, directed, and produced Elvis, the '68 TV special for NBC. Elvis fans give sole credit to Steve Bender for saving and resurrecting Elvis's career, beginning on December 3rd, 1968, when 42% of U.S. households tuning in to watch Elvis regain his magic and keep the crown as the king of rock and roll. It is now my honor to welcome a gentleman that can only be described as a legend, an icon, a groundbreaking visionary who made stars into superstars and paved the way for today's television shows and more. Let's welcome the incomparable Steve Bender. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you, Ward. I can't believe that intro. You're acting as my press agent. I mean, I think it's fabulous. So thank you.
Well, you're very, very welcome and very well deserved. But I want to step back in time here because not only did I watch numerous times the Reinventing Elvis film documentary, but also I read the book about the '68 special. And there was something in that book, or I should say there was another book that I was reading that said that as you were a kid, that you saw a 10-inch black and white TV in a storefront window. Did you have any dream or idea that your future would be working in the television industry?
The truth is, when I grew up, uh, you know, I came from a very modest household, and I had wonderful parents who really kind of devoted their lives to my older sister and myself. And we couldn't afford a television set when they first started coming out. So there was a radio store a few blocks away from our home, and all our neighbors used to go up there and stand in front of the window, and there was this tiny little television set encased in this huge fancy box. Uh, and we all sat, we really came up there to watch Milton Berle and the Texaco Hour, where he had four guys dressed as service station or gas station attendants, and they would be singers doing the commercials. Well, my father owned a truck station in downtown Los Angeles, so I actually grew up since I was in junior high school, pumping gasoline and changing tires and working for my dad in his gas station. So I could relate to that, and I paid more attention to the singers, I think, than I did to slapstick comedian Milton Berle. And ironically, years later, I did meet him in person, and you know, at the time, and to answer your question specifically, I never even thought about getting into the entertainment business. Uh, I spent my youth going to school and going to a park that was right near us and had a wonderful field where we could play baseball and football and what have you. And that was my life. I mean, I didn't even think about what's going to happen when I'm out on my own and having to earn a living and so forth and so on. I just wanted to, you know, pay back my parents for being such great parents and, uh, you know, really teaching me values that to this day I still treasure. And so it was a total fluke. The closest thing to show business was on our block. There was a very famous 1950s film actress named Jean Tierney. And as a little kid, I used to go over to her home uh, and ask for an autograph photo of her. And she would answer the door herself sometimes. And she'd give me an 8 by 10 photo. And I'd go home and throw it in the waste paper basket, go back the next day and ask for another photo. And she was very generous. And but that was it. And I really didn't quite understand, you know, what show business was in those days, other than, you know, a form of entertainment with people who were, in most cases, you know, 20, 30 feet tall in movie theaters. And there were no late night shows where they told you they took out the garbage and washed the dishes and so forth. So they were fantasy characters to me. I mean, I just couldn't relate to, you know, not only to them as human beings, but I couldn't relate to the fact that I might end up in the business one day myself.
Well, you served in the armed forces. How long did you do the armed forces radio broadcast?
I was in there for 2 years, and I was very fortunate. I ended up, you know, because I'd gone to college in pre med as my major. Uh, it was automatic when I was drafted into the Army during the Korean War. And, you know, I thought I was going to Korea. And next thing I know, I got orders to go to Austria and Germany. And I ended up with George Clooney's dad, Nick Clooney, who was very popular in Europe at that time with the AFN, with the American Forces Network. And I was a DJ for 2 years. It was incredible duty, and I really had contemplated when it was time to get out of the Army and had served my 2 years. I was actually contemplating staying over there. There was also an independent uh, radio station called Radio Free Europe, and I was offered a job there when I got out of the Army, and decided after all I should go back to the. I was kind of homesick at that point. I was allowed one phone call a year to my family because phone calls from Europe were incredibly expensive in those days, and so I came home and found out I was going to go back to school. I only had another year to finish to get my diploma. And I decided to go back to school. And while I was waiting around, I met up with a high school friend of mine. And he said, Steve, instead of just hanging out, having nothing to do, I'd suggest you get a job at a television station or a movie studio or a place, because they have lots and lots of pretty girls walking around on the lot. You might meet somebody in the 3 or 4 months you're waiting to go back to school. And that's what got me into show business. I got a job in the mailroom at a local ABC local station in Los Angeles, KABC. And, you know, as you introduced me, uh, just, you know, there's no rationale in it. And I was able to deliver mail at lunchtime to the program director of KBC, Selig Seligman, who was a Nuremberg jury court lawyer in Europe after World War II, and very bright, intelligent man. He had to be. He gave me the job as a full director on the local television station. And I told him I don't know anything about directing, and he said it's okay. There are like 200 guys standing in line waiting for the job, and I just have a feeling you might be really good at it after we had this kind of social conversation.
Well, how did you direct your first show without any directing experience?
Well, the first time I entered a control booth, it was like, walking into a foreign language that you didn't know how to speak. I was listening to the director uh, who was, doing all these commands, ready, take, set up, dissolve, and words that I'd never really related to or heard before. And I told Mr. Seligman that I really didn't know anything about the job. And he said, well, go home and think about it. Come back tomorrow and we'll talk about it. I came back the next day. I went back to the studio. The director was a gentleman named Norman Abbott. He was actually a nephew of the very famous comedy team, Abbott and Costello. And he was leaving KABC to go to CBS to do a new Jack Benny series. And also, he was working with Bing Crosby's brother, Bob Crosby, who had a Dixieland type band at the time. And he said, I'll train you. And he did. And after about 2 weeks of sitting alongside of him and kind of learning the mechanics of what a director has to learn to be able to function in a control booth, uh, in all modesty, I knew the job better than he did. It was like being a duck thrown into water. All of a sudden, all this mysterious code words, etc., kind of deciphered, and I understood everything. And it led me into one of the greatest opportunities to start my career with a really funny slapstick comedian who was very popular with high school students and college students named Soupy Sales. And the big gimmick on our show was throwing pies. And we didn't use real pies, we used paper plates, and we put shaving cream into the plate, and then we'd have a guy off stage shooting blanks. So when the pie hit the subject, the noise of the gun being fired really brought reality to it. And Sippy was a character where he wore a sweater and a huge bow tie, and he had two imaginary dogs on the show called White Fang and Black Tooth, and it was nothing more than a sidekick of Soupy's, Clyde Adler, who would have a fake dog arm on one of his arms, and the white one was White Fang, obviously, and the black one was Black Fang, and the white dog was kind of the good dog, and Black Fang was always getting into trouble. And we just had tons of fun on the show. And it was kind of Soupy's script every day. We were 5 days a week locally. Kids would run home to get to their television sets to see Soupy's. And, Soupy was basically telling dirty jokes without the punchlines, but all the kids knew the punchlines, so that made it twice as funny.
Well, was it that show that had the naked girl segment in it?
Yeah, I was there directing it actually. She was a really nice lady, and she was an actress who, basically when she was approached by my crew, she agreed that she would stand there. The amazing part of it is that I made sure that the camera angles would not show her behind the door. But when Soupy opened the door and he saw this nude woman standing behind it, he freaked out because in his mind, everybody watching the show was seeing what he was seeing, which is this nude lady. and which they obviously couldn't and didn't. But it became very controversial because it became the talk of the town at other television stations, and they had a video of it and were passing it among themselves. Uh, in those days, videotape wasn't even invented. They used a process called kinescope, which was nothing more than taking a camera and putting up against the video screen of your television set and recording it. Uh, just as a side note, the genius of who really capitalized by shooting the series on film instead of kinescope was Desi Arnaz when he did the Lucy shows. He was married to Lucy, obviously, and their show became the most popular show in America and practically all over the world. And he insisted they shoot on 35 millimeter film because he had the vision to look into the future and realize that these had a value for future plays and being seen in years to come after the original was shot, where kinescope was so inferior technically that you couldn't even rebroadcast it. You just have for history's sake, you'd have a recording of the program that you were working on.
Well, that means that I guess Desi Arnaz gets the credit for syndication.
Desi Arnaz was brilliant, and I was lucky enough in my career to do a Lucy special, which we did in London, and with Tony Newley, who was very popular at the time, and it it was amazing because Lucy would still have communication with him, getting it even though they were divorced at the time, but he would be in her life advising her, I guess, for his entire lifetime and hers. And but he is the one who figured out when you're shooting a situation comedy to use multiple cameras, to use three cameras basically, and shoot on film, so the quality would be as good when they broadcast it as when they originally did it.
Wow, that is a I love to hear the stories and the history of how certain forms of innovation came to be. And I know that you were on set, and I believe it must have been maybe it was a grip or a lighting guy. And he said, "Kid, I've seen young directors come and go, but you're going to be a great one." What did that mean to you?
At the time, it meant everything. I wanted to learn because everything I was doing was on electronic cameras, and in the old days, we used to have basically a turret on the camera that you could twist and turn, and we had four lenses on each camera. So you could have a 50 millimeter lens, which were made it very flexible in terms of when you're directing, uh, where when you got to longer lenses, became restrictive in terms of dollying or tracking left and right and so forth. And so I decided with my manager at the time that I would try and direct a 35 millimeter film show. And I ended up directing, believe it or not, I did two Gilligan's Islands. Uh, the Mosquitoes Go to Gilligan's Island, which was, I think I was chosen for my rock and roll chops. And the other one, that Marianne gets hit on the head with a coconut or something, and she thinks she's, uh, let's see, it was Marianne and the other woman on the show.
Yeah, Tina Louise.
No, Tina was the Hollywood star. And I have a funny story. In my first day on the set, when you're shooting film and you're shooting one camera as opposed to multiple cameras, you have to take and relight so you can see various angles. If you want a wide shot, a medium shot, a close up, or whatever. And so when an actor has their turn at doing their lines with a single solo shot, usually the other star will stand behind the camera with the director and feed the lines to the actor that's actually being photographed. Well, I was told that Tina never did this. She stayed in her dressing room, and they had uh, an extra or somebody else, the stage manager or even the directors, feed the lines to the actor. And I was so young and naive and probably stupid at the time. I said, it's unacceptable. She has to be out here, after they do the two shot with her and another actor. When it comes time for the close ups, the other actor's there when she's doing her close up. So she has to be there when the other actor, and I could see the faces of the rest of the cast. And they were like laughing among themselves of who does this kid think he is? And so I went to her dressing room. We stopped production and I knocked on the door and I said, Tina, it's Steve Binder. And I want you to come out and feed the lines to whoever, whether it was Jim Backus or Bob Denver or whoever. Uh, and she didn't respond. And I said, Tina, I'm not leaving until you come out of your dressing room and go on stage and feed the lines. And I stood there and thinking, what have I done? I've just committed suicide as a director. I mean, she's not going to come out. I'm going to go out and be totally embarrassed to the rest of the cast and the crew. And lo and behold, she opened the door. She came out. She fed the lines to the other actors. And I was an instant hero with the entire set of the cast and the crew. And I loved doing Gillian's Island. I mean, I must admit, when I first was assigned to do the show, I kind of, had my nose up in the air thinking this is, a corny sitcom. And even though every week it was probably in the top 10, if not number one in the country as far as viewership. Excuse me.
Yeah, I watched it every week when I was a kid. I don't think I missed an episode.
Kids are watching it to this day. It's in syndication all over the world and constantly plays and replays the episodes. And when I was on the set, I realized, these are serious actors and technicians and so forth. And I not only had a great director of photography, Dick Rollins, who taught me a whole lot about, various lenses and when you're shooting uh, on film and so forth and so on. And, I was very, very fortunate. They asked me, the producers asked me to come back, and there was another show that they were producing called It's About Time with Imogene Coca, who is famous for her Sid Caesar sidekick shows. And so I said I would do it and had a lot of fun doing that show. But unfortunately, that was the last episode and the show was canceled. And that was the end of that. I went back to electronic cameras and for the bulk of my career. And had no idea, even when I was starting out, that I was going to make this a lifelong profession. I was still in the back of my head, thinking, I've got to get back to college and finish to get my degree, which I never did. And who really changed my life was Steve Allen. You know, uh, After the Soupy sales experience, and Soupy was so popular, we even went on the network, on ABC network, once a week while I was doing the 5 day a week daily local show. And my first guest was Frank Sinatra, who called me and asked, "Can Soupy throw a pie in my face?" First of all, I didn't think it was really Frank Sinatra. I thought he was kidding or it was some character pretending to be Frank. And it turned out to actually be Frank. And his son was best friends with Soupy, who had two boys the same age. And they kind of bonded as they were growing up. I think their homes were next to each other in Beverly Hills. And so I think Frank was just kind of paying back all the favors that he felt Soupy had done him by helping, raise Frank Jr. And and my next guest was Mickey Rooney, who, you know, Marlon Brando's called the greatest actor who ever lived. Uh, and the third guest was very popular at the time, Tony Curtis, who had been making movies with Burt Lancaster, who I became really good friends with in later years. And that kicked off my career. When I left Soupy, I was offered a jazz series with 26 of the greatest jazz artists in America at the time, from Cannonball Adderley, Shorty Rogers, the Stan Kenton Big Band, Nancy Wilson. And that was when I really, really learned how to direct. I worked with at CBS with a technical crew that was kind of famous for their work on a dramatic live series called Playhouse 90, and all of them really, for whatever reason, blessed me with their past experiences and taught me so much while I did those 26 half hours. I had, because of the budget, I had no time to rehearse. So I would rehearse on paper over the weekends, try to go out to their homes or wherever they happened to be, that they would kind of play me what they were going to do on the series. And I, at the time, had really felt strongly a visceral feeling about shooting jazz, that it had to be in extreme close-ups and break the rules of, where normally you'd have a master shot of a wide shot, then you'd go in for medium shots and close-ups and so forth. And I decided I would do a series of close-ups back to back, if I had, because what I was shooting not only was the talent, but I was shooting their instruments, and I was shooting a extreme close up of a trumpet from as many angles as I could figure out, and I learned, which was invaluable in my entire career, how to count music bars, and because jazz, normally speaking, in pop music or even in rock and roll, it's pretty traditionally in 4/4 time, meaning 4 beats to every bar. In jazz, it's all over the place. It's 7/8. It's 2/4, and you have to learn how to count those so you know when to get to the next camera shot. How many bars is the trumpet going to play? How many bars is the drummer going to play? The saxophone, the trombone, et cetera, et cetera. And it gave me an incredible uh, insight and experience in how to shoot music. And, so because I think television in general, uh, I don't care how much money you spend on sets and scenery and extras and actors and what have you, if it doesn't move you as a viewer, if you don't cry or you don't laugh or you don't feel something inside of you that you don't quite understand, but it just makes you, uh, react to the words spoken or the characters that you're watching, or relate to the heroes or the villains or what have you. It's a waste of time and money, in my opinion.
You know,
And
I went back through your history, and I know that the Jazz Scene USA, and as you said, you directed 26 episodes. 1962. And as I'm hearing you explain that, I think back of some of live performances that I've seen on television where you have an artist or maybe it's a band, and then there comes let's just, for example, you have a band, and all of a sudden you have this amazing guitar solo coming in, and for some weird reason the camera decides to pan to the audience when all of the fans at home want to see the guitar solo happen, and everything's completely missed. And sometimes I'd sit there yelling at my TV set going, what is wrong with that director? He missed a great shot. and but you learned how to do that way back in the early 60s.
But with the exception that if you have a star like an Elvis or a Diana Ross or somebody, you don't want to leave them while the musician is doing their solos. You may on certain occasions, but I love shooting reaction, not necessarily the action. I love seeing the body language while they're just listening themselves to, 4 bars from the trumpet player or the bass player or whatever. And I like to see the star, uh, you know, and not necessarily when they're performing, when they're not performing, and that I find really interesting in terms of their body language and so forth.
So did the Jazz Scene USA, that helped you when it came time to film the T.A.M.I show, correct?
Well, what really happened is in the middle of shooting Jazz Scene, which was hosted incidentally by Oscar Brown Jr., who was a brilliant jazz artist himself out of Chicago. And in the middle, I had finished about 13 of those 26 episodes, and I got a call from Steve Allen, who was executive producer on Jazz Scene. And I had never met Steve. I'd never talked to him. I admired him from his early radio days as a teenager. In fact, I used to trek up to Sunset Boulevard and the plaza that was there for some of the major radio stations. And he used to conduct his radio show just like a television show. He'd have a full audience, and it was lots and lots of fun. I used to take the bus to get there because I was too young to drive, and sit in the audience and listen to his improvisational humor, which was second to none. And he said, Steve, I think you're doing a wonderful job on my show, Jazz Scene. And I've just signed a deal with Westinghouse to do a 90-minute, 5-day-a-week late night show from Vine Street and La Mirada in Hollywood. And I want you to direct it. And I told him I can't. I haven't finished Jazz Scene and I'm only halfway through. And he said, well, why don't you at least get me on the air, do the first show, and in the meantime, I'll look to replace you on one of them so you can finish the jazz series. Well, 2 years later, I'm still directing the Steve Allen show for Westinghouse and having a ball. We had artists like Frank Zappa, we had Woody Allen, we had Bob Dylan on, and normally the audience for the Steve Allen show would think they were comedy acts. They didn't realize they were historical, icons in the rock and roll music world, etc. And so it was so fortunate because at the time the music critic of the Los Angeles Times newspaper was Cecil Smith, and Cecil wrote an entire piece in the entertainment section of the Times. He had my picture, and he said, "Who has the best job in television?" or something like that as the title. And then he went on to talk about my directing Jazz Scene and at the same time doing the Steve Allen show. And I would literally uh, shoot the Jazz Scene shows, get in my car and drive up to Hollywood and Vine and launch the Steve Allen show. The interesting tidbit, which people don't realize, we were in the same building where Groucho Marx had a very popular show called You Bet Your Life, I think it is. And when I went into the basement of the building of the studio, I found all these cue cards. They call them idiot cards in the early days of television, where they used to write the script and hold it up. Stage manager or the cue card guy would hold it up to the artist so they could just read off the words that the writers had written. And I realized that that show, which I thought was totally improvised, and the guests were so funny, etc., was all scripted. Even the guest lines were on these cards that I found, and had a great experience with Steve. I mean, he literally uh, sent me out of grammar school to junior high to high school to college. You know, that's where I earned my master's degree on that show, because Steve was so open to me trying anything new. We would do crazy things on that show where, we had a side street called La Mirada next to Vine Street, perpendicular to it. And we used to have, for instance, we had a portable swimming pool that we filled with Jello, and we had Steve dive into the Jello, and our audiences were always going crazy. And this was a time when Johnny Carson was under contract to ABC doing a daytime show, and when NBC uh, stole him away from ABC and wanted him to do the Tonight Show, which he obviously did as good, if not better, than anybody else. Uh, he was restricted by ABC from starting the Tonight Show almost a year after we started the Steve Allen show. So we had no competition when we went on the air, even though we were in syndication. And the show became super popular. I mean, we had, uh, audiences requesting a year in advance for tickets just to come to the theater and participate, because we used to include the audience in a lot of our stunts. Steve would in some way figure out where he wanted to go out on Vine Street. We'd stop the traffic, and the whole studio audience would go out there with him. And crazy stunts like that. We had a Arthur Murray dance instruction, uh, which was across the street in a apartment building about 3 stories up. And we took a crane one night and had Steve go up and uh, do a really funny bit where he climbed in the window of where this class was going on with dancers. And as I think about it now, and I think of all the crazy stunts with elephants and wild animals, and we even had a guy from an alligator farm bring a live alligator onto the set, who we determined in the afternoon uh, that the lights and the whole television setup was disturbing the alligator. So we decided that we would put gaffer's tape around the alligator's snout so he couldn't open his mouth when we did the bit. Well, unfortunately, the trainer's assistant was in the men's room at the time we made this decision. And when we actually did the bit in front of the audience, where the animal trainer would come out with the alligator, the assistant reached over and undid the gaffer's tape, and instantly the alligator grabbed the trainer's shoulder. And we had kind of an honest life and death struggle going on right before we were to introduce him to come out. And we're in the middle, I remember, of a band number with the Don Trenner. And we had a fabulous band with, some of the greatest players, Ray Brown on bass, and the Condoli brothers, Jimmy Zito, who did that incredible, if you ever heard the record, I've Got My Love to Keep Me Warm, I think with Les Brown. And Jimmy Zito did the trumpet solos in that record, which to this day I still have in my head. And it was one of the great recordings. But these were all the musicians that we had on the Steve Allen Show. And Steve was very musical himself and encouraged so many great artists, the Lionel Hamptons, to come on the show. And unfortunately, Steve could only play in one key. So every artist who came on the show who duetted with Steve had to change their key to his. And in many cases, it was the wrong key for a lot of artists. So they, even though they loved to be with Steve and the exposure and so forth for them, they hated the fact that they were playing or singing the song in the wrong key for them. And but overall, it just was a great experience and learning experience. I remember one of my cameramen came to me and said, "I've been playing with this lens in my garage," and he showed me it was a long lens where you could have an extreme close-up of something. And so I brought it to Steve, and Steve said, "Well, let's put it on the air." And I said, "But it's going to be out of focus for most of the time we use it, because it's very, very difficult on this lens to keep it in focus." Steve said, "It's okay, try it and see what happens." Well, the first thing we did is we had a flea show, and we got a guy who literally had a flea circus where they were very difficult to see to the naked eye, but under this lens you could see he had created a whole world of fleas for himself. And with this lens, we were able to see him, and the audiences were right with us. I mean, they didn't care whether the camera was in focus or out of focus. And it also taught me in my future directing, follow the action. If somebody goes off stage and, because you're trained to stay on the set and, et cetera. And I, in my entire career, I forgot about all those things, saying the audience, as far as I'm concerned, they just want to be entertained. If the actor walks or happens to be off the set, it's okay with me. I'm still gonna, have the camera follow them off the set, etc.
Well, how did
And
the T.A.M.I show happen?
well, we took a hiatus with the Steve Allen Show, and I was approached. I had just done another show previous to T.A.M.I for the same producer, Bill Sargent, which was in commemoration of the integration of schools in the South. I think it started at the University of Alabama, and where Bobby Kennedy, I think at the time, ordered the National Guard in to allow 3 black students to integrate into the university with all these white students who did not want to have, integration happen, along with, the governor at the time, became quite infamous, was totally for separation of the races and so forth. And it got to the point, with all the, the division of in the South at that time, they had separate restrooms for whites and color. And, that was all going on, and I was approached by this producer. It's actually three of them who asked me to do an hour special that wouldn't be played on television and it wouldn't be played in theaters. It would be in arenas. So we ended up in major cities all over the country. We were at Madison Square Garden in New York. We were at the Sports Arena in LA. We were at a big arena in Houston. Uh, and it was called the Freedom Spectacular. And I did an hour show hosted by Burt Lancaster, who I became very, very good friends with over the years. And we did a slew basically of, anti-Korean War. Let's get out of this mess, which to this day, I don't think there's ever been a settlement I remember when I was in the Army, I was given uh, some kind of medal we were basically an occupation nation at that time. And, I think to this day, they've never ended the war and resolved it. And the Korean veterans, are still considered active members of participants in the Korean War. And thank God I ended up on the other side of the world in Europe as opposed to Asia. But it was that triggered the T.A.M.I show. The same producer came to me and said, do you have the time to do? I'm toying around with the idea that there in electronic television, as soon as videotape came in, all the producers dropped kinescope and went immediately to videotape. And in those days, we started out, thank God, with 2-inch videotape, which is what I did Elvis on. And the quality amazed me of how, to this day, how it held up over all these years and how good it was. And, since then, with digital TV, etc., we've advanced light years ahead of where I was at the time. In those days, we were inventing everything. We didn't even have filters for our lenses in those days. But the T.A.M.I show was the brainstorm of this producer named Bill Sargent. Bill Sargent to me was like Mel Brooks' Play the Producers. Uh, he produced it, but he didn't have the money to finish it. So unfortunately, when we got to the end and he had run out of money, the president of a film company, American International, which was doing all those teen beach films with Frankie Avalon, Annette Funicello, uh, you know, and they did a lot of horror movies. They were kind of very light comedy horror with Vincent Price, the actor, and so forth. And he bailed Sargent out, but on the condition that he owned the negative. And after the T.A.M.I show, he called me and said, we want to do it again next year. And then he sort of read off what their plans were. And I declined to do it because I didn't feel it was really pure rock and roll. And they had the Russian actor who was on The Man from Uncle, I think it was, the blonde lead actor as the host, as opposed to when we did the T.A.M.I show. We had my friends at the time, Jan and Dean, who were incredibly popular and were very involved with the Beach Boys at the time, singing on their records and so forth. And the T.A.M.I show was a total fluke. I mean, I used my Steve Allen crew along with film people that I hired to do it, but we shot it The entire T.A.M.I show was shot on 3 studio cameras and 1 crane, and that was it. Today they'd probably have 22 cameras for that show. But the thought that out of all the artists that appeared on the T.A.M.I show, that 90% of them would be today members of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame was totally a fluke. Nobody could have predicted it
Well,
when,
yeah,
when
I
we did.
went back and actually watched some of the old performances from the T.A.M.I show. Of course, you know, the biggest star at the time would have been what, Leslie Gore, but then you had James Brown, Rolling Stones, you had Chuck Berry, Marvin Gaye, Smokey Robinson and the Miracles, the Beach Boys, like you said, Janet Deans, the Supremes. The list goes on and on. And I went back and watched some of the footage, and I watched a performance by James Brown and blew me away because I had to watch it twice because his performance, I believe it was around, I think it was around like 6 minutes. And it's where he would drop to his knees, act like he was in exhaustion. They'd put the cape on him, then he would get up. But what I saw was his impeccable timing to every beat of that song. He knew when to continue the acting, and then right when it was time to sing, he was right there at the mic. He never missed a beat, and it was so phenomenal to watch.
James was, who I never even knew of. I didn't even get to rehearse him because when he's the only one on the T.A.M.I show that when we allocated time to rehearse each of the acts before we actually shot them on Electronovision, it was called, and it was nothing more than kinescope, but on commercial television, the Congress of the United States determined that television in the United States would be built around 525 vertical and horizontal lines. And you couldn't expand that uh, nationally. And so when Europe came out with their version of television, they actually weren't restricted to the 525. They actually had more lines which build up the quality of the picture itself. And what happened is that Bill Sargent decided when he called his company Electronovision that he didn't have to worry about commercial broadcast. He was doing this independently and he wanted to be able to put them into theaters. Well, he was such a visionary because today a lot of feature films are shot on this process, basically digital television. And even George Lucas, when he does Star Wars, they're all done digitally now. And anyway, what happened is that he expanded the lines when I did the T.A.M.I show from the 525 normally in a television camera. He expanded those lines up to around 900 and some lines. They got as high when I did another film with James Whitmore on the life of Harry Truman called Give 'Em Hell, Harry. We were something like 1,400 lines. So we had, by leaps and bounds, we were increasing the quality of the picture. The picture was always fine on the close-ups, but when you started to have the wide shots and so forth, that you could see the lines separating basically on your screen, even though you didn't understand technically how television, to this day, I don't know. I mean, I think it's an absolute miracle. We can turn on a TV set and the pictures come up, and I was there when they went from black and white to color, and to me that was a miracle too. Uh, but I remember vividly when I was directing, I think Jack Parr or Danny Kaye, one of them said uh, that they didn't want the monitors to show color because it would distract the audience and they wouldn't pay attention to what the show was saying or doing. And, you know, all stars have their idiosyncrasies. I remember Jack wanted the studio freezing cold so the audience wouldn't fall asleep while he was performing and doing his monologues and so forth. Uh, but anyway, getting back to the T.A.M.I show, these acts, when we put them together, and I think Jack Nietzsche, who was a giant in the field of music, was the musical director on T.A.M.I, and I think he was responsible for booking a lot of these acts. Uh, you know, it was right at the time of the British invasion with the Rolling Stones and the Beatles and so forth. Um, and uh, they were so fresh. You know, you're right when you said Leslie Gore was the biggest star in the film. She had giant hits with "It's Judy's Turn to Cry" and let's see what was a few of her other big hits.
What?
Uh,
It's My Party? Was that hers?
"It's My Party" was another giant hit by Leslie.
You had all of these acts in the T.A.M.I show, like you said, ended up in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame years down the road.
But what's interesting about it is uh, when you get into the history of T.A.M.I, and I even had you know a lot of phone calls from people wanting to know what T.A.M.I stood for, since it was just the initials, and it was Teenage Music Awards International, which was what it represented. Sargent, who was the original producer, he actually was thinking of doing one of the T.A.M.I shows every year had he been able to make it financially successful. But it was uh, the acts were so young and new that they really had maybe two or three at the most hit singles on the charts in Billboard or Cashbox or Record World, and uh, they they weren't even distinguished in terms of their identity. There was no Mick Jagger and the Rolling Stones. It was just the Rolling Stones. There was no Diana Ross and the Supremes. It was just the Supremes. And it was years later that these artists emerged as sort of the face of the act and so forth. Uh, but it was a wonderful, wonderful experience for me. And you know, I didn't know when I said I would do it. I had no idea what I was getting into. And when we had the final screening for ourselves before it was put in the theaters, we went to the laboratory where they were developing uh, the negatives of the film. The head of the company, I think we were at Technicolor, one of those technical buildings, and he leaned over to Bill Sargent. I was sitting next to him, and he said, "This is a total disaster." And he said, "Bill, you these shots are way, way too close, and the theater audiences are going to walk out once because they're going to get dizzy and all of a sudden I got kind of sick to my stomach and I'm saying, have I shot this in a style that it's not going to play in the theaters and so forth? And thank God he was wrong. And, you know, the going to the theater and seeing it in front of a live audience and hearing the reaction and the kids singing and standing up and trying to dance in the aisles was, you know, and it was consistent. The last two performers in the movie were James Brown and the Famous Flames, great, you know, supporting group. And James, I will say, was such a genius that he would hear a musician play a flat note or a sour note, and he would fine them right after they finished shooting doing the number. I forget what the number was, but okay, Bobby on trumpet, you owe me $25. I mean, you hit a you know a bad note in the middle of that song, or whatever. But he really, I became, after that, I became very close to James, and I went to a few of his concerts. And he was a one and only. He wanted to be a boxer when he was young, and I think that's where a lot of his physical dancing moves, etc., came from. If you kind of think in terms of a boxer in a boxing ring, and the way they move their feet and around, you could kind of identify with James. But he was. I told him that I was going to have the Stones perform after him, and he said nobody follows James Brown.
I
To me,
I read the story, and Keith Richards said that was the biggest mistake they ever made.
I think it was the greatest mistake they ever made, because I think by the time they performed, Mick convinced himself he was James Brown, and I think one of the things I insisted upon is that we shoot this thing unlike any other uh, film that was done at the time, and that the entire cast had to be there for the entire shoot so they could support each other. And I think, it may be subtle and it may not be obvious to most, but I think the fact of the chemistry of all these acts, not trying to outdo each other, but doing their best work, really wanted to do a great job on each of their sets, added a great deal to the success of T.A.M.I. And the uh, uh, the Rolling Stones, Mick in particular, were out in the audience watching James perform before they went on to do their thing. And I think when Mick came out, he had uh, basically transformed himself into a form of James Brown himself. He was dancing, jumping up with a tambourine, and so when it went into theaters, interestingly enough, I saw it twice originally. I saw it in Beverly Hills to an all-white audience, and they loved the Rolling Stones. I mean, that was their thing. Then I went and watched it in an area in Crenshaw where it was almost an all-black audience, and by far James Brown was the act that they were there for, etc. But I thought Smokey and the Miracles, the Beach Boys were phenomenal. It was the only time on film that we really captured the original harmonies that Brian had taught the rest of the group. And when they went on the road, he kind of dropped out and didn't go with them. So it was never, you couldn't hear those harmonies the way it was done on the T.A.M.I. show. And, I had an opportunity years later to do a series with the Beach Boys. By that time, each had their separate lawyers and they were suing each other. And it was, Brian was going through a period where I think a psychiatrist or psychologist was his sidekick at the time, who was writing his name on Brian's songs as a co-writer and so forth. And it was that was a dark period in the Beach Boys' history.
I
And
heard a story, and a lot of people say they don't know if the story's true, but it really adds to the legend of James Brown, because the story is that when he walked off stage after his set, he walked right by the Rolling Stones and said, "Welcome to America."
I never heard that story, but it sounds logical to me, so it may be very true. And but James was mentored by, uh, ironically, uh, his manager, who was Jewish, uh, was like a father to James, and they were really, really tight. And he was, you know, so supportive to James. And I think when he passed, you know, uh, and James was now for the first time kind of on his own, I think that's when he got into a lot of legal problems and so forth and so on. But he was well protected at the time I did T.A.M.I.
Well, when
With,
after the T.A.M.I show, then there was Hullabaloo. When did you start feeling that you were hitting your stride with working with all of these amazing series?
it's strange. I think working in my dad's gas station kind of, uh, when I got into the entertainment business, I never put any of the stars on a pedestal. I never, as they say, kiss their behinds or whatever. I just felt I was there to make them look great in front of the camera. That was my goal, not to show how great I was as a director or whatever. And I only became a hyphenate producer because I got tired of producers who were frustrated directors kind of whispering in your ear all the time of, change this, do this, and so forth. I wanted to protect what I was directing. So I became my own producer director. And, in those years, there wasn't the committee mentality of, second guessing what's going uh, on the screen with the director making the decisions.
Well,
And
that makes sense, because sometimes there's just too many voices going on in a production, and people get rattled or ticked off, or it goes south. But I'm hearing through the grapevine that there could be a remake or a resurrection of the Tammy Show in 2025. Want to comment?
I was very fortunate now to have a partner who we are so compatible and such good friends as well as in business together. And he has this vision of redoing the T.A.M.I show. I don't want to redo it. I think it stands on its own feet and should be kind of left alone. Uh, I remember when Disney did a contemporary Fantasia, which the original was done in the 1930s. And as good as it was, it was in comparison, there was no comparison compared to the original. And so I'm open in our discussions to doing a T.A.M.I show that is similar to the original, but not the show. If we did the show in my head, uh, I would try and find artists who kind of matched the original cast, which would be impossible. As big and as great as the new artists are, they're not the originals, and so it's still kind of up in the air. Uh, my partner has Spencer Crawford, has great taste. He was responsible for the documentary that we did on reinventing Elvis, and he has a whole slew of credits himself as a rock and roll record producer. He was Clive Davis's assistant for years, and and he's into the business of the business. I'm into the show of the show, and so we make a good team. And so I'm still open to exploring possibly doing another type T.A.M.I show, but not redoing the T.A.M.I show.
No, I completely agree. And it's funny because I know Spencer as well. Love the gentleman. I love the business side, and I love the show side. So I like I love both sides of the coin when it comes to the entertainment industry. And as I was watching Reinventing Elvis, I was so impressed that here is this time in the 60s that there's a lot of race relations going on, but you allowed, you know, your productions to become very racially diverse in a very organic manner. And it really seemed to come forth when you directed the famous Petula Clark TV special, when Harry Belafonte was the special guest. And then it was the touch seen around the world. Uh, that must have been some moment.
Where I never ever intentionally wanted to make a statement regarding race. It came to me organically in all these projects because there was and still is so much racism in our country, and it kind of blew me away. Uh, Taking the Petula Clark Belafonte touch, uh, I had shot it film style with no audience and multiple takes and so forth, and there were like 5 takes where they didn't touch, and the sponsor representative saying when the touch happened, and he freaked out and stormed out of the client's room, saying they'll never put that on the air. Uh, I went down to the editing room and I ordered the editor who was recording the show to erase all the takes where they didn't touch. So the only take left was the one where Harry or Petula reached over and touched Harry's forearm. And so NBC had no choice to use anything but that take. I didn't realize it was going to become a shot heard around the world. Newsweek magazine and Time magazine picked up on it and had photographs of it. It became very controversial. Harry was going on the Tonight Show to tell blacks not to buy the sponsor's product. Uh, and I had to talk him out of it, saying it was just one guy at the company who was a racist, but it wasn't the company, because the president of the company was very supportive of my doing the show without any other guest stars. That was the big controversy. NBC loved to load up their shows, their variety shows, with multiple guest stars who they felt would help the ratings. I always thought that was phony. I thought it wasn't relevant at all if they didn't make a major contribution. When I did a CBS Diana Ross special, we had Larry Hagman on the show because CBS insisted that I put him on because of his popularity in Dallas as JR. And I said, if we're going to book somebody, we got to book JR, not Larry Hagman, because that's who the audience really loves. And it turned out, where he ended up duetting with Diana singing a Marvin Gaye song. And, right before the death of Marvin Gaye, when they uh, decided to rerun the special, and, they had to take that particular piece out, or the introduction out. Uh, but I've never believed in that. And when they came to me after I booked Belafonte, and I was real fortunate to be able to do that, because Harry at that time wasn't interested in doing any more television. He had won Emmys previous to that himself on his own specials that were brilliant. Always wanted to work with him. And NBC came to me. Well, the story gets deeper than that. I got a phone call after I booked him from the agency representing the sponsor, telling me at first they jokingly said, "What color car do you want?" Because they were so thrilled that I had been able to book him. And then the next call I got was, "We got a problem. You got to get rid of him." And I said, "What do you mean?" They said, "Well, the sponsor representative doesn't want a black man on the show. That's off the record. Uh, on on the record, they think he hasn't sold any, uh, hit records lately. He hasn't been in a hit movie lately, and they don't feel he's popular enough to be on the show. And I said on the phone that if I had to get rid of Harry Belafonte, I would go nationally and say exactly what you just told me. And they said, we'll call you back in 5 minutes. And I got a call from a guy who replaced the guy that I was talking to. He said, we're going to work this out. NBC is going to send you a list of who they'd like to see on the show. And because the contract says guest stars with an S at the end, we'll leave Belafonte on the show, but we want to have somebody equally important on the show with him who's not black. And they sent me this list, which was hysterical. I wish I kept it to this day. I know it had Milton Berle's name on it. It had Ray Bolger from The Wizard of Oz on it. And I called him back and said, all of these names are unacceptable, and I'm just going with Belafonte. I was then ordered to go to Detroit, Michigan to meet the president of the car company. And he was very supportive. And he said to the guy who was a racist, he said, Mr. Binder, are you happy with the show? And I said, absolutely. And he said, is Petula happy with the show? And I said, absolutely. And he said, and he turned to his employee and he said, I don't think we should interfere with them. If they're happy, we should be happy too. The guy jumps out of the chair, comes over to me, shakes my hand and says, I'll see you at the Emmys. And that's the last time I saw him until we actually taped the show. And then he went nuclear when Harry and Petula touched each other.
Was that Doyle?
Pardon me?
Was that Doyle? Was that Doyle
No.
Lott that got mad about that?
Let me think.
Because I think he was fired after that aired.
I think I was doing another show a few years later, and I was in the deep, deep South. I was in Georgia at the time, I think, or Alabama, and one of my crew members brought me the official newsletter from the Ku Klux Klan called the Georgia Thunderbolt, and the headline was how I destroyed this great American's career at the sponsor by exposing the situation. But
what was interesting to me as you're telling that story, Pat Boone told me the exact same thing happened to him. And I'm not going to mention the car company's name, but Pat will tell the whole world who it was because they were the sponsor of his show. He had Harry Belafonte on his program, and the sponsor got mad because Pat always had black artists on the show. And they told him no. So Pat, his attitude was, okay, fine, here's the deal. Harry Belafonte stays, but once the season is over, I'm not coming back. And that's how Pat put it to him.
Wow, that's great.
So I thought he had, a high level of integrity to do that. And even Jamie Foxx, the actor, I think it was been about a year, actually ran into Pat and actually asked Pat about the story. And Pat said, yeah, it's completely true. And Jamie was just stood there and literally thanked Pat for standing up for Harry and the rest of the culture. I thought it was fantastic.
Interesting. I actually did Debbie Boone's last special and had a great experience. I always felt if somebody who was really hot and popular at the time did the same special as Debbie did, we'd have swept the Emmys that year. As a result, because it was Debbie, and after she had that one huge hit record, she didn't follow up with anything huge. And I loved doing the special with her, and I found her really great to work with. But the show kind of came and went without getting the acknowledgement. Had a Barbara Streisand been the star instead of Debbie or somebody, it probably would have been a whole different ball game with the general public loves to know in advance if you've been blessed with the good housekeeping seal of approval. I mean, I remember when I discovered an act in the 70s when I had my own record company called Seals and Crofts. And the first gig we did was in Pasadena, California, opening for the Carpenters, who were really hot at the time. And the audience booed Seals and Crofts, screaming, "We want to see, we want to see the Carpenters, want to see the Carpenters." And that same audience who were booing Seals and Crofts, doing all their material, the same material they did after they broke Summer Breeze. And here was the same audience now standing in line to see Seals and Crofts and paying top dollar at the concert venue when the exact same act was being done a few months earlier when they were nobody and didn't have a hit record, and the audience was booing them,
Yeah,
so
I have always been a big fan of Seals and Crofts. I still listen to the music today, and because I like that genre. Seals and Crofts, England Dan and John Ford Coley. I mean, the list goes on. But it was, I was reading and understanding that when you did the Petula Clark TV special, that they say that it was your rebellious handling of that special that led Bob Finkel to ask you to direct and produce Elvis's TV special.
true. Bob was under contract to NBC when Tom Sarnoff, who was the president of NBC at the time, approached Bob. He wanted Bob to produce and direct it. Bob was a terrific 1950s variety producer director. There was one other, Bob Banner, who did a lot of hit shows in that era. The two of them sort of dominated the variety field in terms of who were the best at producing and directing. And Bob called me up and he said, "We have a deal for Elvis, but it's only with the Colonel. And we every time I try and talk to Elvis, he keeps calling me Mr. Finkel, and I can't get him to call me Bob. And I was thinking this special may never get done, even though the Colonel had made this deal." And what I never knew, and Priscilla told me much later, that Elvis, after the first meeting he had with me, came home saying, "I got a feeling about this kid, Binder, and no matter what the Colonel says, I'm going to do whatever Binder wants me to do." I never knew that. And he did. He lived up to every, anything I asked him. He was more than anxious to give himself, put 100% into it. I think that's the beauty of the special. I've said it many times. I think rediscovering himself was the most important thing that happened on that special, because I think he had convinced himself at that stage of his career that it was RCA's publicity machine. It was the Colonel's genius that got him where he got, but he never felt he deserved it. And I think when all of a sudden, it was that Sally Field, when she won the Academy Award one year, she looked out at the audience and she said, "You love me, you really love me." And I think Elvis got that feeling when he started to tape the special that we were doing, that he realized, it's me. I'm the one with the talent. I'm the one with the charisma.
Yeah,
And
when I saw Baz Luhrmann's Elvis movie, my favorite part in the whole movie is about the '68 special. And Jerry Schilling and I spent some time talking about it from his perspective, what he had seen. And then I started doing a little bit more research about it because I found that the '68 special was there's just something so special about it. Then when I saw Reinventing Elvis, which, ladies and gentlemen, is actually airing on Paramount Plus right now, so you can watch it. It truly portrayed this whole TV special in a whole new light, especially for fans. But what got me was from Baz Luhrmann's Elvis movie to Spencer Proffer producing Reinventing Elvis, and then it's really the story about you creating this TV special for Elvis. I was shocked on how big a villain Colonel Tom Parker really was. And in the documentary, you didn't hold your feelings back about the Colonel.
Well, for good reason. You realize that Bones Howe, my partner at the time in '68, who was a major hit record producer, we had decided to combine both our talents in television and the music industry into one. Because they were, television people were never invited to parties at a movie producer's home or whatever. And we were always in the music industry at the time, uh, kind of the outcast uh, uh, field. And that certainly dramatically changed when they realized the amounts of money that the music industry was generating at the time. Uh, but it was really a case of, uh, you know, I refused to direct the Elvis special, uh, and I told my agents at William Morris at the time, who also represented the Colonel and Elvis. You know who the victor would be on any controversy, or they were going to side with where the power was, which was Elvis and the Colonel, obviously. And I said, I'm not going to direct uh, the Elvis special unless you guarantee that if a soundtrack album that Bones and I are going to produce, we get credit for it and we get a royalty for it. And the Colonel blew his stack and threatened to, not use me on the TV special, period. Soon changed his mind because obviously Elvis got to him. And it was really a case where the Colonel called me at home and he said, I've got good news for you, and you can start the TV special tomorrow because there is not going to be a soundtrack album. I guarantee you that. Well, the day before, he made the phone call to me congratulating me because they were releasing the soundtrack album on RCA. He had made the deal with RCA before he made the phone call to me. I ended up with zero. We never got paid a penny. In fact, my entire income from Elvis uh, was the initial. I think I got to produce and direct and create the show. I got $35,000, which I gave half to my partner, Bones Howe. And they didn't even acknowledge that Bones was even on this special. He at the, when we started out, uh, it was uh, basically they wanted to use the Bob Hope Orchestra for the musicians instead of what we hired basically the Wrecking Crew, all the great Los Angeles studio musicians, and and I think that soundtrack with Billy Goldenberg arrangements really drove the special. I mean, it gave it the energy. It gave Elvis the energy to want to perform those songs because they weren't dated. They were updated without changing the feel of them in a sense. So it was brilliant arranging by Billy. And it was a fluke that I got Billy Goldenberg to even do the show because the only person that Elvis wanted involved, it was totally my group and my team that we had done a special previously with Leslie Uggams. Leslie at the time was starring on Broadway in Hallelujah Baby. She was very popular on television doing a Mitch Miller Follow the Bouncing Ball show where Mitch and his choir would sing songs, and on the screen they would have all the lyrics, so you at home could sing along with them and so forth. And then following that, I did the Petula Clark special with the big controversy, and then we did Elvis, and so from the standpoint of the Colonel. Bob Finkel turned out to be the greatest executive producer one could have on a show because he kept the Colonel out of my hair and away from Elvis and myself when we actually did the special. The Colonel was constantly playing games. They were playing liar's poker, and Bob intentionally would lose because the Colonel was having so much fun. And Bob said it was a small. I don't know how much it was, but it was a small fortune that he contributed to the success of the Elvis show by letting the Colonel keep winning on Liar's Poker. There's a great story. I don't know how many times it's been told, but the Colonel sent over to Bob's house a case of Don Perignon expensive champagne. And it just so happened that Bob was having an important dinner party that evening. So he pulled out a bottle and decided that, they would serve it for dinner at his home. And it turned out that the Colonel had refilled every bottle with Gatorade. And that was typical of Parker. But they played games by themselves. They took photographs of each other and exchanged them. Uh, and Bob did the greatest service of just entertaining the Colonel to the point of where the Colonel, you know, didn't in any way. I don't even remember him other than on his birthday where we had a little champagne and birthday cake off stage where Elvis sang a song that my writers Alan Bly and Chris Beard had put together. Uh, and other than that, I don't think the Colonel ever set foot on the stage. He insisted when they offered him a dressing room, he insisted that they clear out the broom closet next to the stage, and they put a little tiny desk in there. It was ludicrous. And he had two William Morris trainee agents dressed as English palace guards standing in front of his little door, uh, you know, which is all this kind of showmanship, you know, circus barker mentality. And and we got called in there one day, and the Colonel was very upset because he had no control over what was going on. Uh, he was intent on doing a Christmas show a la Perry Como or Andy Williams. I had no intention of doing that. And he called us in, and very seriously, Elvis and I stood in front of this little tiny desk with the Colonel sitting behind it. And the Colonel said, "It's been called to my attention, boys, that here we are halfway through production and we still don't have a Christmas song in the show." And I said, "If Elvis wants a Christmas song in the show, I gladly put it in, but he hasn't said anything. I mean, he never asked me." And he said, "Well, Elvis wants a Christmas song in the show. Isn't that right, Elvis?" And Elvis, with his head bowed and his hands, in front of him, uh, almost looking, like a little boy, uh, he nodded in the affirmative. And I said, "Okay, I'll put one in." And, "Okay, boys, you can go back to work now." And we walked out past the William Morris agents or trainees, and as soon as we got clear of that, Elvis jabbed me in the ribs. And I remember it vividly because it hurt like hell. And he said, using the F word, he said, F them. And that was the end of it. And I never put a Christmas song in the show to the very end. It wasn't until I delivered the master. And this is a really interesting point. I ended up, when we did the improvisation, with about 2 hours of material. Elvis forgot he was doing television. He was just having a ball, and especially with DJ and Scotty, his original drummer and guitar player, there with him. They hadn't seen each other in years. DJ and Scotty hated Colonel Parker. He felt they felt he was responsible for breaking up the original trio. And but because of Elvis, I convinced him to come out. And you know, that improv segment on the special was a 100% improv. There was no script. We didn't rehearse anything. Every uh, day after we finished whatever our schedule was, Elvis had a bed put into his dressing room, and he lived at NBC during the entire pre and production segment of the show. And it, he had rented a home in Beverly Hills for Priscilla and Lisa. Lisa was only a month old at the time, and he told me that he didn't want to waste the time driving from Burbank to Beverly Hills when he could be really relaxed and focused on the show if he lived out at NBC. So we put a bed into his dressing room, and every day, whoever happened to be hanging out, and we hadn't even thought of Scotty and DJ at that time.
But no, because I was, that was one of the questions I was going to ask you about, the improv,
The
because you saw them singing. I mean, like you would spend what, 8 hours on set, and then Elvis and his entourage would be in his room, and then they would sing for hours. And you saw the real Elvis during that time.
And I knew I had to capture it. I knew that was better than anything I was doing with big production numbers, etc. And it was really a case of uh, Colonel absolutely would not allow me to bring a camera into the dressing room. And he was sick and tired of me by that time. And it was a case of where I think because I hounded him every day, every time I saw him, I want to do the improv. And finally, he broke down. He said, I won't promise you can use it, but I'll let you recreate it on stage. Never thinking I was going to move that fast. At that point, I had no money for sets or anything. I'd spent all my money on the production as it was originally planned. And we used the boxing ring without the ropes again. That's when Elvis came to me and said, if we're actually going to recreate it, do you think you could get DJ and Scotty to come do it with me? That was genius because I don't know any artist that could have cold just picked up as if they had been friends the day before and jammed the day before. They hadn't seen each other in over a decade. And all that material, I had no idea other than reminding Elvis what he did in the dressing room when he was talking about his past and experiences and the censorship. He couldn't move from the waist down and so forth. And whoever at CBS made the decision not to shoot him from the waist down without realizing it did him the greatest favor because the audience that saw him uh, was always wondering what's going on from the waist down. That's so, you know, uh, controversial that they can't even show it on television. And it was ludicrous that anybody would make that kind of a decision. But it helped the folklore of who's Elvis Presley, who's this wild kid who's changing the youth of America. I mean, radio broadcasters were saying he's destroying the youth, and you know, uh, he's representing an evil side, and he's corrupting the youth, and so forth.
But I
And,
found something interesting about the whole improv session. You see Elvis and the rest of them in the dressing room just singing, having fun, Elvis being Elvis. Then you bring the whole setup on stage. But the small hiccup is that when it was time to duplicate the jam session, Elvis went blank. Was it from being so free in the dressing room that now he was going to have to perform that jam session? Is that why he went blank?
well, since I insisted, in fact, I think one of the great portions of the book that I wrote on Elvis is that when I told Alan Bly and Chris Beard, my writers, that we were going to do this improv segment, they ran to their office and actually did a script for Elvis. I said, guys, you don't understand what the word improv means. It means he's going to improvise it. He doesn't need a script. Whatever happens is going to happen. And uh, I'm able to I preserved that script that they wrote, and I put it in my book, which I think is really kind of humorous after you know the story of the Elvis comeback
Yeah, and
special.
here's the book, ladies and gentlemen, and it's available everywhere. And I always, when you see the film documentary Reinventing Elvis, there's so much in that documentary, but your book fills in the blanks even more and brings certain stories beyond the documentary, but they both complement one another. And I believe you just said it a few minutes ago, the impromptu jam session was actually 2 hours long before you took it into post production?
Yep, he did 2 sessions. Uh, and, the Colonel, when I went to him and I said, how many tickets do you want to see Elvis do this? He said, Steve, you've never understood the Colonel. And if you're going to give the Colonel any tickets, you got to give him all of them. That means no NBC executives, no sponsor executives. Nobody gets to see the show. But I guarantee you, I'll deliver an airplane full of blonde, bouffant, hairdo, blue-eyed girls from Memphis, and who are fanatical Elvis fans. And I went out of my way to convince NBC and the sponsor to give the Colonel all the tickets. Well, that was the dumbest thing probably I ever did, because the Colonel the entire time tried to sabotage the improv segments. And, there was no airplane. There was the day before we shot it. I was leaving the NBC lot, and a guard stopped me and he said, do you need any tickets for tomorrow's taping of Elvis? And I said, what tickets? And he had a whole stack of tickets at the guard shack. And he said, some bald-headed guy came over to me and handed me these tickets and said, give them out as people come in and out of the studio. And I realized I had totally been duped. So we had no audience the next day. I was expecting it, the line to be a mile long, and we hired extra pages at NBC to handle the crowd and so forth. I got a call that morning saying, Steve, we don't know what's going on, but there's nobody here. And so Bones and I jumped into action. We got a few local disc jockeys in LA to actually advertise on their disc jockey shows that if you want to come see Elvis, head to NBC and you can see him for free. And we went to what became a pretty famous drive-in restaurant called Bob's Big Boy, and people were it was a drive-in, and people were sitting having their breakfast, and we went to them and said, if you want to see Elvis, come back this afternoon and go to NBC. And we told all our wives and girlfriends and people who were working at NBC but could get off at the time to come be our audience. And that's how we built the two audiences. But it was a total gamble. The day of, uh, I got my stage manager said, you got to go see Elvis. He's in the makeup room getting ready, and he needs to talk to you. So I went down to the makeup room, and there were other show people in there being made up and so forth. And Elvis said, excuse me, but could you all leave here so I could be with Steve alone for a few minutes? I've got something really important to tell him. And so everybody left, and just the two of us in this huge makeup room. And he said, Steve, I hate to do this, but I can't go out there. And that's the first time I realized, and I said, what's going on? And he said, my mind's a blank. I don't remember anything that I did in the dressing room during the week. I don't remember any of the stories I told. I don't remember any of the songs we did. And, I said, well, Elvis, you got to go out there. There's an audience waiting for you. You're being introduced right now by Finkel. And, I don't care if you go out there and say hello and goodbye and come right back, but you got to go out. And I turned my back on him. And before I left, I wrote down what I remembered from the improv sessions in the dressing room. And I wrote down a lot of the song titles, the story at the Pampa Civic when, the Vice Squad was there and he had to just use his little finger as opposed to move his normal, natural way. And I had no idea whether he was going to come out or not when I went to the control booth. And eventually one of my cameramen said, look at my viewfinder. And there was Elvis walking up to go on stage. And I had no idea what was going to happen. There isn't an artist in the business, I don't care who they are, that could have just walked out cold, not knowing what they were going to do or say, that would just sit down with two guys he hadn't seen in a decade and be able to do what he did in terms of, turning on the magic that made him the king of rock and roll. And that was the real Elvis that nobody ever saw. They talked about it, his early appearance, which I happened to see when I wasn't even in the business, when he appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show. And I was kind of amused by him and enjoyed it. But then when I saw him do variety shows, like Steve Allen had him sing Hound Dog with a real hound dog on the table in front of him and had him dressed in a tuxedo. Milton Berle, I think, hit him with a powder puff or something. And they were making fun of him. They were the hit hosts of American television in the 60s were hosted by either singers like Andy Williams or Perry Como or comedians like Steve Allen and Milton Berle. And that's what dominated. And I understood why they would want him to do what they had him do, but that was not Elvis Presley, and that's not what I wanted to see. And when all of a sudden he opened up and got relaxed, and as I said, probably forgot he was even on doing a television show. He was just having a ball doing what he did years earlier with the guys at Graceland. And it was magical from beginning to end. The irony of the whole thing is when I edited the 60-minute show, and in those days, 60 minutes really only meant about 48 minutes of entertainment. Right. It was filled with public service and commercials and all kinds of peripheral things that had nothing to do with the show. I had no room for the all this platinum, double platinum, triple platinum material that I was sitting with all this improv. And I went to NBC and I told them that I had edited a 90-minute version, and could they purchase another 30 minutes? I went to Singer, the sponsors. Could they purchase another 30 minutes so I could air the 90-minute version? And they turned me down cold. So we ended up, when the first show aired, it had very little of the magical improv stuff. It had the big gospel production, it had the Guitar Man production, but it had, I could only use some of the improv material as introductions to these big production numbers. So I could only use maybe 15 or 30 seconds of material. And yet it still drew that gigantic audience. And what triggered the success of it is the acceptance of the special and the acknowledgement of how great Elvis really was by his peers. When critics and musicians came out raving about, his performance and how shocked they were, their expectations were so low, and all of a sudden they're seeing what they wish they could have seen years earlier, but never had the opportunity to, because of all of his movies that he was doing and all those television appearances and so forth. They were shocked, and then the real irony of everything is that when Elvis passed, NBC decided to put on a 3-hour tribute to him. They got Ann Margaret to host it. They played Elvis first, and then they followed it with a friend of mine who unfortunately passed away a few years ago, Marty Pacetta, who directed the Aloha Hawaiian special. And they played the shows back to back. And they sent a gopher who probably wasn't even at NBC when I did it in '68, down to get the master. He ran downstairs, and for whatever reasons, he pulled the unauthorized 90-minute version that I had originally edited. Excuse me. Mm-hmm. And the minute that played in that 3-hour tribute, they never ever played the 60-minute version again. Thank goodness.
Steve, I went back and I was doing some research, and I found it ironic that you delivered the master tapes on August 16th, 1968, 9 years to the day that Elvis died. And then, like you had said, it was NBC that aired the complete 90-minute version of the special, including the Bordello segment, which it aired November 20th, 1977. And now it's the 90-minute version that everybody remembers.
And it's the only thing that they play. Now, when you mentioned the Bordello segment, that was named the Bordello by an NBC executive. And I thought it was a joke when it first happened. And then NBC, when I was taping it, there was a rumor spreading that I was going to walk off the show if they didn't let me tape the Bordello sequence, and which was untrue. I never ever thought of leaving the show. I was having such an incredible time and relationship with Elvis that I became a huge fan of his. My window with Elvis only was the '68 special. Never knew him before. He showed up to work on the '68 special, never talked to him after the last day we said goodbye to each other. And the Bordello sequence, I brought everybody on stage the sponsors, the NBC executives, anybody who had anything to do with the business side of the making the special. And I said, look, there's a rumor that you object to a lot of things on this segment. Uh, I want to straighten it out now so that, unanimously I get everybody to sign off and approve before we shoot it. I said, what are your problems or your feelings about removing anything? First thing is, well, the girls' cleavage is too exposed on all their costumes. So we brought the costume department up with black lace, and we fixed all the bodices of all the ladies so their cleavage didn't show. I said, okay, what else is a problem? We went through each stage and we finally got to the end. And I said, okay, is there anybody here who objects to anything that we're doing in this segment? No, everything is fine. And I got everybody's blessing, the sponsors, NBC, to do the bordello sequence, which I did. And, it was all innocent fun. And it showed that he's a guitar man who goes on the road seeking fame and fortune, and he goes through these various experiences, and one is temptation, and before he even makes any contact with anyone other than our blonde actress. Uh, and in my head, it was her first day in the bordello, and she hasn't even had any experience as a prostitute or what have you.
Yeah, was that
And
Susan Henning?
yeah, and they get raided, and then he jumps out the window and he's on to his next adventure. So it was total innocence. And so then when we're doing the hour version, NBC says, look, it's out of our hands. General Electric has just bought NBC, and we're going to have a executive who probably makes toasters in New York for General Electric come out and make the final decision. So this guy shows up from New York. He's wearing a brown suit with brown shoes and socks, and I take him to the tape machine to play the master for him. And now when I get down there, he's already come early, and he's watching a segment of the Dean Martin show. And Dean is doing a segment with a over 6 foot blonde bombshell with big boobs, and this sponsor guy or the General Electric guy is laughing his head off, thinking it's one of the funniest sketches he's ever seen. So I think in my head, oh, this is going to be a piece of cake. I mean, there's no objection to what we did compared to what's going on now. This gal is probably falling out of her top of her bikini and so forth. And, in Dean's, who I loved and worked with many times, was having a ball just on the edge of you know, doing material that was unfit for television and so forth. He was a master at that line. And so the guy comes over to our machine, and I play him the bordello sequence, and he looks at it and he says, out. And I said, what do you mean out? And he says, you can't show that on television. There's a bed in it with brass, hardware and so forth. And, the gals are all hookers, are all prostitutes and so forth. You can't show that. So I just went bananas. I mean, I just, I, and unfortunately I lost the battle. That's, I just gone through the Petula thing where I erased all those takes where they didn't touch. I'm thinking to myself, this is insane that they're not allowing this into the show.
Well,
And
as Steve, as the production was being filmed, when did you start to see Elvis the rock and roll star and not seeing the singing movie star?
From get-go. I mean,
Really?
he told me from day one. In fact, I was a little nervous because after we pitched him the outline of the show we wanted to do, which had all those elements in it, from the gospel segment to the only thing that was left out because we weren't planning it on it was the improvisation. And we didn't have that in the rundown or the script at the time. And but Elvis, uh, I after we pitched it, he said, "I love it. Let's do it." I said, "Well, do you have any suggestions? Do you want anything put in or taken out?" Or no, no, I love it just the way it is. Let's just do it. And it made me nervous because every show I'd ever done previous to that and after that, the star always has something to say about the script. And he, uh, you know, I think one reviewer had mentioned that they never saw anybody perform on television and give the performance uh, where he could have been in an arena with 100,000 people, and you know, even in that small venue and that small audience, he was putting out every ounce of his talent that he possibly could. And that's the way he was all the way through the production from day one. Tell me what to do, and man, he committed to not just learning the material, but understanding the material, and it was so much fun to work with him. And the crew got to know him so well that even when we did the final song, which was the original Earl Brown song, If I Could Dream, we all kind of had a feel one-on-one with Elvis where everybody came to the same conclusion. He was not a redneck. He wasn't a racist. And, he was really a fun-loving, funny, great sense of humor kind of guy who we all would have been fortunate to have as a friend and hang out with. And it was a real joy. I hated finishing every day's work and going home. I would have stayed there, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, just to keep doing it because, I couldn't go home and go to sleep. I was, uh, it was, I couldn't wait to get back to keep doing it. Even when we edited, and it was in a way painful. We had so much material to edit. And in those days, they didn't have all the technical equipment that they have today. Uh, we shot it on 2-inch videotape. We transferred it to Kinescope for editing, and then when we came back, uh, we basically went back to the 2-inch tape to make all the edits. But the only way you could make the edits was to physically cut the tape with the scissors, which was very scary. And then they had basically acetate, which they would take the two pieces and put together and put the acetate to make it hold. And it was like a miracle. It worked phenomenal without any mistakes, without losing anything. And it all fit together like a glove.
Well, I've got to ask you because everybody talks about the last song, If I Can Dream. It's extremely powerful. Even in your book, you explained it as being one of the few goosebump moments you've ever had. But I want to go behind the scenes of that song because there, I when I had a discussion with Jerry Schilling, and we were talking about when Elvis was in the studio and he was recording "How Great Thou Art," and He said that it was that particular song for him and everyone in the studio, that when Elvis sang it, he gave it everything he got, and it was just like God's hand came out of heaven and touched the man. That's how powerful the moment was. And as powerful as the moment was for Elvis's TV special when he sang If I Can Dream, you explain in your book that as great as that segment was, it was far more powerful version that he did in the studio, but you didn't have a camera.
Yeah, we were at a recording session with him, and there was no need to bring a video camera in at the time. It was at a different location away from Burbank. Uh, and Elvis wanted me to make a copy for him so he could learn the song at home. So he asked if he could just do a dummy version of it. The orchestra had already recorded the soundtrack to If I Could Dream. And and then normally in a recording studio, especially in those days, you put the soloist in a booth, soundproof booth, and with a little boom mic over their head. And Elvis said, "Do you think I could have a hand mic to sing?" So we got him a hand mic, no booth, and by that time we're in the largest studio where Sinatra had recorded, Bing Crosby had recorded, Sammy Davis had recorded, etc. It was a huge studio, one of the best audio recording studios in Hollywood, and it was Western Recorders at the time was the name. They eventually merged with another company called United, and it became United Western. But at this time, it was just Western. And uh, Elvis on this huge stage with nobody there except myself, Bones, our PA, the studio's personnel, the utility person, and I walked in, and the only thing you could see were all the amplifiers that the musicians had used to record with the little red light buttons on the amplifiers that were still lit. And I told the Western recorder utility guy, I said, "Could you turn all the lights off except in the control room where we are?" And he did, and it was an eerie effect of seeing this humongous facility, and you could just see this string of red lights from these amplifiers. He gave Elvis the hand mic. It was a cement floor, and he got in a fetal position on the floor with his hand mic and curled up. And now we played the soundtrack back, and that's when this performance happened. He not only knew the lyrics to the song, and he didn't have a cheat sheet or anything. He just had it from memory. And to me, it may have just been the moment and the environment and everything that made me feel like it. But I swear, I wish I had cameras because that's what I would have put on the air instead of the way we did it at NBC. But Elvis at that point wanted to lip sync. And I said, no. And I had him sing live to the soundtrack at NBC. And yet he gave this tremendous performance. He never ever sang If I Can Dream Again, even when he
No.
went out on his tour and everything. I like to think, I could be 100% wrong, but I like to think because the song was so special to him that he didn't want to repeat it, so to speak. Uh, and I think he meant every word that he sang. It's interesting to me because I live now in a world of Elvis fans, and a lot of them write to me, or if you go on Facebook or anything, and there's still a lot of them who think he's, a redneck, a Trumper. uh, and I can't express enough just how much he and I had in common, even though we grew up 1,500 miles away from each other. We had a lot in common in our own upbringing and childhood, and I just considered him a really good guy. The night that Robert Kennedy was assassinated at the Ambassador Hotel, we were in the middle of piano rehearsal with him at my offices on Sunset Boulevard, and we heard a commotion from another room in the office that had a television set, and it was live on television, the Sirhan assassination of Robert Kennedy. And that evening, we stopped rehearsal after, we were waiting for the next morning to hear the results of whether he would live or die. And we spent the whole evening talking about what's going on in our country. What's this with Martin Luther King and John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy. And Elvis was really into it. I mean, he really had studied the John Kennedy assassination. And what I found interesting when uh, I shot a documentary for Graceland with Priscilla hosting after Elvis had passed. I found it interesting that when I was in his room, there was nothing Elvis in it. I found it really interesting. There were history books, uh, his other artists, but no Elvis, even though the whole Graceland was a tribute to him and his work and so forth. But in his private quarters, in his bedroom, there was nothing Elvis. It was, and he was, you know, what you would call really street smart. He had not, had an advanced education in college or whatever, but he was certainly up to date in terms of, what's going on in the world. And that's when he told me, uh, a few days later when we're screening the show for him, he told me he never wanted to sing a song he didn't believe in again. He never wanted to do a movie he didn't believe in the script, would not record any more songs that the screenwriters were trying to stick into the movie for financial reasons. And he wanted to go around the world and meet all his fans, and he didn't do any of that. I mean, the Colonel unfortunately got his hooks into him again, and persuaded him. And I know a lot of fans resent when I say he became a Las Vegas saloon singer for the bulk of it, the end of his career, at the end of his life. And it was tragic because I knew inside of Elvis, he wanted to break free from the Colonel and do all the things he told me personally he wanted to do. He never got to do any of them. But I also feel strongly we can't blame a third party. We are all responsible for our own lives. And whatever decisions he made, you can't say the Colonel made me do it or whatever. He has to take responsibility for decisions he made.
Well,
And
let me ask you this, because I've thought about that moment, and I've reading your book, watching the film documentary, and I always kind of wondered. So I'm just going to ask you now: if Elvis had the strength and the gumption to walk away from the Colonel, and he asked you to be his manager, what would you have said?
I'd have turned him down. I love directing, and I love working with new talent. Uh, and the truth of the matter is, I would have liked to have been in his life as a director, as a producer. but I would not have given up my other career uh, to become a manager of Elvis. And I've spent a lot of my life trying to help. It's easy uh, if you're already established and you're already a star. It's easy to get anybody uh, to get involved in your career and so forth. Most difficult thing I find in show business is for a really super talented artist to break through, because that has nothing to do with their talent. It has everything to do with timing and luck, and getting the right. I mean, if you're represented by Live Nation, you know you've got a ready-made marketplace to expose your talent. But if you're struggling just trying to get people to acknowledge your talent, it goes back to my story on Seals and Crofts, where they did their first concert opening for the Carpenters. They were booed when they went on stage. This is how they have a hit record, and the next time people are paying top dollar to see the same act, only this time they're cheering instead of booing. And so uh, as much as I respected Elvis and befriended him and vice versa, uh, I would not have wanted to devote the rest of my career on him.
Well, I tell you what, you know, the 68 TV special Elvis. I mean, it's not just music history, it's television history. 42% of the households tuned in and reignited his career from that point on. And like I said in the beginning, Elvis fans will give you sole credit for doing that.
Somebody said to me early on in my career, after I did the 68 special, no matter how many films or television shows you do, Steve, you'll only always be remembered as the guy who did the comeback special in 68. And there's a lot of truth to that. I mean, I've had, especially this past few years, in the twilight of my career, uh, it's all about Elvis and all these, you know, shows I've done over the years with John Denver, uh, with Smokey Robinson and the Motown series. Uh, go back when I created Don Kirshner's rock concert format. Uh, they're irrelevant compared to my doing the Elvis Presley special. And, I've been blessed and fortunate to have been able uh, to have worked with so many talented people. And, you know, uh, I, I've always approached it as, everybody on that stage is focused uh, on being a team, and we all have our jobs to fulfill. I can't be the art director. I can't be the set designer, whatever. But I have to speak their languages, and when they get blocked, I have to unblock them. And that's the real job of a director, in my opinion. Uh, Surrounding yourself with the most talented people you can find and letting them do their thing, uh, you know, with the understanding that, because you are the director and the leader, that you are the final decision maker of this team. And, I have found if my crews, in many cases, are trying to save me, and half of them go to the right and the other half go to the left, it'll turn out to be a disaster. Get everybody on the same page going the same direction. Even if it's the wrong direction, it turns out right. Uh, and, as a director, uh, you have to answer so many questions all the time. People coming up to you saying, the first time I ever directed Bob Hope, who, I never wanted to do one of his shows and turned him down actually, uh, because he had little respect for the visual side of television. And, he thought he was still doing radio when he was doing his television specials. But when I came home and told my parents, you'll never believe it, but Bob Hope asked me, where do I stand to do such a thing? I couldn't believe it. I mean, Bob Hope was one of those 30-foot figures in my youth that I never ever thought I would meet him, let alone be his director on an occasion. And I feel that about a lot of the talent that I work with. That yeah, and yet we end up, where I think it's a great advantage to say, I've got my job to do, you've got your job to do, and nobody's any more important than the other person because my job is to make you look great. That's my job. If people notice the directing, uh, the camera work, and so forth, it's a bonus. But that's not what I want to see on my shows. I want to see the talent emerge as at the top of their game.
Oh, I
And
completely agree. I mean, because when I went back and looked at your body of work, and IMDb doesn't even list it all, but you worked with Barry Manilow, Randy Travis, Disney on Ice, Primetime Emmy Awards. I mean, Pee Wee's Playhouse. But I have to ask you, Steve, because when you did Diana Ross in Central Park, which is another iconic moment, um, what did it take to do a special from Central Park, especially in that day and age?
well, the interesting thing in that particular special is uh, Diana had a great relationship with Barry Diller, who at the time was the president of Paramount Pictures. And she wanted to build a children's park in Central Park. That was the goal of doing the special in the first place. It. I took her out to the field where we were actually doing the special, and this was going to be a satellite broadcast all over the world. And I had all my cameras in position in this empty field, and uh, I I was very fortunate going back to the T.A.M.I show when the first time I met Diana when the Supremes performed on it. That was 1964. I had maybe done 5 or 6 Diana Ross specials for CBS. We did a jazz special for American Express, and so forth. So we had a really tight friendship relationship and trust. One of the first specials I did, she's in the middle of singing a song from The Wiz called Home. And when I showed it to her after we shot it, and it was brilliant, her performance, she said to me, you can't show, she pointed to her throat, and you can't show that. And I said, what are you talking about? She said, well, my veins are sticking out. I said, Diana, people are looking at your veins while you're in this emotional, fantastic ballad. You know, uh, we have to, I don't want to cut away from it. And anyway, after it aired and got really good reviews, she came to me and said, you know, I enjoyed working with you, and I think we're going to do a lot of really great things. And never once did she question my directing after that and all the other specials I did with her. Then Central Park came up. I took her out to the venue in Central Park, where over 2 days we had, I think the estimate was in combined in the 2 days was 1,300,000 people were in that park seeing her. This little figure is on a stage all by herself, controlling all these people in the fist of her hand. And she looks out in the field, and my two key crane cameras, she says, you got to get rid of those. And I said, what are you talking about? And she said, it's going to block the view of some of the people who come to the park to see me perform. And I said, Diana, those are what I call money cameras. They're going to be, you know, close-ups of your face, etc. I'm not getting rid of them. You didn't bring me from California to do this special if I don't protect you. And she said, you know, you have to get rid of it. Now Barry Diller, the president of Paramount, comes up to me and he said, Steve, you're a bright boy. You're going to figure out how to get rid of those cameras. Diana does not want them in the park. I said, Barry, there's nothing more in life that I'd like to do than get rid of those cameras, but I'm not going to, because I need those cameras. When Diana looks at that video back, you know, and they aren't there, she's going to wonder why those shots weren't there. And so I go back to my dressing room, and there's a knock at the door of my hotel room, and it's Diana by herself. And I could see she's been crying. And she said, Steve, you've got to get rid of those cameras. And I said, Diana, trust me, I would love to get rid of them, but I'm not going to. I said, you're not, you know, you got to trust me. And, you know, and she left. And the next morning, all night long, I couldn't sleep. I'm thinking, you know, waiting for the phone call to say you're fired or whatever. Next morning, I show up at Central Park, and there's a big press conference about to happen. And I hear, Steve, Steve, and it's Diana. She's about 100 yards away from me, and she's screaming, you know, at me. No mention of the cameras whatsoever. He comes up, we hug each other, and she says, you got to go with me to the press conference. And so I go into the tent where the international press is, and they're questioning her, etc. Never once did we discuss the cameras. Right? By time the first night, I think there were 700,000 people or something. You couldn't even see where those cameras were. I mean, they were buried among people, and you know, it was never even mentioned. And you know, historically, you know about the big rainstorm and so forth. She was phenomenal, and probably saved some lives that night in terms of the panic that was going on. And she kept constantly staying out there, saying, "Be calm." You know, there are children out there, etc. And that's the day that some thugs climbed the wall at a very important restaurant in Central Park and stole the customers' jewelry and so forth. There was lots of muggings going on in New York City at the time. It was real chaos. And then the field no longer was a grassy mall. It was a mud. You know, it was horrible, and
It was Woodstock, basically.
We had this. Now the interesting thing, it only happened where we were in Central Park. The sun was shining on the perimeter all around Manhattan, and I had a camera up on top of the Gulf Western high-rise office building in Manhattan, which you know, was filled with all kinds of weather equipment and electronic equipment that would have electrocuted my cameraman if when that rainstorm started, and he split immediately. So I lost that camera on the rainstorm portion of the show. And it was magical. I mean, it was at one point I had one 10K light that was the only thing that was not shorted out and still working. And I think one of the reviewers said it looked like the Diana Ross show in Central Park was lit by God. He wasn't joking, and I agreed with him. It was so dramatic, and she stood out there in this uh, amazing rainstorm that I'd never been involved in, especially being from California. We never saw rain like that, and my crew stayed up all night long trying to dry the equipment from the night before, and so we could continue shooting the next day. We cleared all the stations and satellites for the next day, and the next day was weather-wise was perfect, and we did the entire concert. I was using for the first time uh, one of my technicians. I had decided I want him to be my technical director, to sit alongside me and put the pictures on the screen. And it was his first big job as a technical director. And when the rain hit, I had spent hours working on the script and deciding which shots to use. Uh, I think I used on Central Park. I think I had 5 or 6 cameras is all. And there again, uh, in today's world, they probably have 50 cameras to do Central Park. And it uh, as soon as the rain hit, I turned to him and I said, Keith, let's close our script books and let's wing it and let's just go with the flow. And we in the control booth, and the control booth was a remote truck that was sort of a state of the arts. It was called Green and Crow uh, truck, which was used on all the Streisand specials and all the major variety specials. And uh, as I said, it was a state of the art video truck and audio. And I looked down, and we had about a foot of water in that control booth covering us. Uh, the crew was worried instantly about being electrocuted because of the electronic equipment. We had a live band below the stage, and all their equipment went out almost immediately, and they were playing acoustically for a little while. And you know, it and I won the what was at that time called the ACE Awards, but it was like winning the Emmy for Best Direction and so forth. But I had my normal, really talented camera crew, which I was. There's a handful of guys in Hollywood in those years that did all the major shows, all the major award shows, and so forth. And not just myself, but all the directors in that era tried to use those same guys because they're just so talented. And, I was lucky enough to have this crew doing Central Park, and the pictures were phenomenal. I even had a handheld camera that wasn't tied into the rest of the equipment, and he was kind of on his own shooting audience, which I was able to insert uh, later on when they replayed the show. Uh, but it was the highlight of her career. I mean, even her family, when we were screening it at an editing facility, were just in awe of her performance. And as she said, it took her a lifetime to get there, and she wasn't going to leave because of a little rain. and but and what was really funny is that Barry Diller, who was the president of Paramount when he was on stage, they thought he was Mayor Koch at the time, and here you hear 700,000 people, and then the next day 500,000 people booing Barry Diller because they thought he was the mayor of New York, But it was a great experience, and you know, uh,
But you've
the
been part of, I mean, you've been part of some extremely, iconic moments in television, from Elvis to Diana Ross, and the list is extremely long. But I've got to ask you, how would you like to be remembered outside of the Elvis 68 TV special?
by my family and friends. I want to be, uh, known as somebody who speaks the truth, uh, you know, has integrity, and somebody, uh, you know, they can be proud that they were related to me and or were my real friends. And it's really, and as I'm, in the fourth quarter of the game of life, I want to be remembered by the people who, uh, you know, that I'm in contact with that means so much to me, that contributed to my life. It's a big sacrifice as you're pursuing a career like I've had, where you can't help. I mean, I have two beautiful daughters. Uh, my wife, uh, and her family have brought so much joy to my life, uh, that it's important, uh, you know, that I not sell out. That I, I think there's one thing. Uh, there's success that has nothing to do. There's talent has nothing to do with commercial success. Commercial success to me is timing, talent, and luck, and assuming that everybody out there vying to get in the business to become successful, uh, the true artist is what really, is important to me, not the people who've, had 15 minutes of fame, uh, and just happen to be at the right place at the right time. Commercial success to me is not proving yourself as a commercial uh, success. Uh, I mean, when you look at a Robert De Niro or Meryl Streep, uh, you realize these are gifted, really gifted people, and even the material they choose is special. If you're paying money at the box office, you're never going to be cheated because they phoned it in. And and in the music field, which I love, I never considered music different than drama. I always felt the lyricists or the great poets of the 21st century, and those are the people that I respect. If you're insisting that they take all the black jelly beans uh, out of the jelly beans they give you when you're backstage, it has nothing to do with talent, and it just has to do with your ego, and when they say, uh, you know leave your uh, leave your egos at the door. uh, I just feel every project I've done, I haven't had to deal with that, other than one or two occasions.
Yeah, and for you, because you have such a stellar career, what is your advice to up and coming filmmakers?
Well, I deal with a lot of kids. I taught for years, producing and directing course at the University of Southern California, and I've taught at various universities and colleges. I love being one-on-one with kids. I always joke that it saved me hundreds of thousands of dollars in going to a shrink to work out, any problems that I might have. And so to this day, I mentor a lot of students, and give them advice and so forth and so on. Now we tell them, don't listen to advice, just take, what you want to and throw out the rest. But I, I think there's such a great future for anybody who wants to get into the entertainment field now, because when I started, there were only 3 stores. It was, CBS and NBC and syndication. There was no Fox in those days. And, now it's a whole different world, a whole different business. And, but I think if you want to get in the business, there are 100 places to go to try and get a job in the mailroom like I started, and work your way up. And you always know on any production, take Pee-wee's Playhouse. It was a great combination of professionals and amateurs behind the scenes working together. And Paul Rubens, who was Pee-wee, had a great eye for talent. And so it just was, on that show, I could tell you in 4 bars of music, I could tell you who's going to make it, who's not, just by, the gophers on the show and how, what kind of commitment they really made. You don't become a successful producer or director or anything by, just saying what your title is and hanging out at bars and going to parties and stuff. It's hard work, and you have to be ready, willing, and able to make that commitment and make the sacrifices. I've been fortunate, because I've lived so damn long, to be able to spend a lot of time lately with my family and friends, where in, the real working days of my life, you didn't have time to socialize or spend at home with your family. And in many cases, you never get to make it up. In my case, I've been blessed where I've been given the time and the opportunity to do so. So I'm very happy with, the life I've been lucky enough to participate in, and the people that I've met, and the people I've loved, and hopefully they've loved me in return.
Well, I've got to say, ladies and gentlemen, long before Norman Lear, Aaron Spelling, Mark Burnett, and others, there was Steve Bender. And if Steve Bender only had Elvis the Comeback Special on his resume, he'd have earned a special place in the TV Directors Hall of Fame. But often producing in addition to directing, Steve not only has a director's credit on Elvis, but the legendary 1964 T.A.M.I. show with the rock and roll top stars of the era. Leslie Gore, the Rolling Stones, the Beach Boys, James Brown, just to name a few. But Steve Bender had scores of other music and variety specials that followed for all the networks. Add on the directing stints for Diana Ross, Barry Manilow, Randy Travis, like I said before, Disney on Ice. There was even the Danny Kaye show. And as Steve mentioned earlier, the Steve Allen show. And even 4 stints as Primetime Emmy Awards director. His list is so staggering, even IMDb doesn't even list them all. But Steve Bender's favorite saying is, whatever you do in life, do it with passion. And we can say that not only did Steve do it with passion, he did it with innovation and became the creator of what we see on television today. And I want to thank you, Steve, for your time today, a lot of time today. And thank you for sharing your insights on your star-studded career in television.
Well, I appreciate you as a host and interviewer, and I've been so relaxed talking to you, I don't even realize how much time has gone by. So thank you.